and welcome to the Spriting mini lecture. I will be demonstrating a lot of the spriting techniques in this lab in this short speed paint. So starting in the beginning, I am going to begin with a sketch. The lines don't have to be exact. I'm mostly just drawing them out regularly without caring for where the curves and jaggies are, because I just want to have the idea on paper. The cleanup will come later, so you'll notice that there are a lot of really weird areas where there are a bunch of pixels or some lines that don't quite flow right, and that's fine, and I'll fix it later. Coming up shortly is the hair, which I actually end up drawing on a separate layer. You don't necessarily have to do that, but with programs like Photoshop or Medibang, which I'm using, it can be easier if you want to do that without messing up everything that you've already drawn. So moving on, here I'm going to be fixing the outlines. You can see where I make a lot of small pixel revisions to make sure that the curves are accurate and I'm not leaving random little jaggies all over the place. If you follow the edge of the horn, you can see that I try to make sure there is this gradation of pixels to make the curve read clearly and smoothly. Generally, you should be able to just tell when a line doesn't feel quite right, but in case that doesn't quite come naturally to you, you can make sure that you are counting the pixels and making sure that they're staggered so they don't read as a weird break in the line. I'm also remembering to fix a few tangents where the pixels might come together and start reading really weirdly with different shapes. I am redrawing the sleeve there just to fix the curve as I mentioned before. I believe I am just cleaning up edges all over the place now. You do not necessarily have to use an entirely new drawing on top of your existing sketch as the cleanup. You can actually go into your existing sketch and just erase and adjust pixels as necessary. This is entirely a decision that is up to you and what you are comfortable with doing. This outline doesn't have to be set in stone either. You'll see later on in the coloring process that I'm fixing a few edges as necessary. Just keep in mind what you've learned about the jaggies and curves, which is the main focus of all the outlining. Some shapes will need sharper points, like the end of the tail or little floating pixels that aren't necessarily surrounding anything. Just keep in mind that they will read differently and try to figure out what you in particularly want for your sketch. I am just blocking in colors. Programs like Photoshop and Medibang will do this very easily. I am just using the fill tool and switching back to the pixel brush. I know programs like Piskel also have a fill tool, but the layers might be harder to work with, so just do whatever you're comfortable. I start the tail off with a few random pixels, but this isn't actually an example of dithering. It is more just me trying to capture the texture of the tail scales and spots. On smaller sprites, this is 64 by 64, but not actually that big. You might not necessarily have the space to have dithering read correctly, so trust your own judgment on that. I instead have this method. On the tail, I'm trying to create texture, so the method I use is I just splattered pixels as necessary, but overall have general blocks of colors and highlights as necessary, as you see here. This will be different depending on what kind of shape you're trying to paint. Here, when I do the fluff, I use different method where I'm just blocking the shadows. I don't have that many stray pixels. I add in the red highlight and change the colors as necessary. But overall, it's a pretty simple shading method. I am not actually caring that much for how the edge of the shading comes out. I'm just letting it be a little bit more organic and just shading wherever the brush sees fit. In retrospect, she looks like she's crying here. That's not intentional. Don't worry about it. I didn't draw on the eyes, so I'm just going to put the color where I feel it should be. I'll edit it a few times as necessary, but that is just something that I prefer to do. Here's a little bit of blush before I move on to the horns, which are shaded similarly to the fluff. Remember, there just isn't enough space for a lot of the dithering or blending techniques, but on a larger canvas, if this were, let's say, 128 by 128, I could probably actually have the space to do a little bit more in-depth gradients. I adjust the color of the lines before moving on to the hair, which I have to color shift a few times to make sure that I can still tell what I'm working on. The highlights come out a little bit weird, but that's just whatever, and an issue very specific to the sprite. Remember that for the hair in the back, since it is in the background, the highlights will also be less bright and eye-catching, just so that whoever's looking at this can still tell what's happening. I attach red highlights as necessary before I believe I move on to the cloth. This is where blocks of colors and separate layers make it extremely easy to work with, since as you can see I'm not really worried about pixel overlap, which actually isn't something you really care about in pixel art, because you're working at a small enough scale that doesn't matter. I block in the rough shadows before I actually go and attach the surface detail to the cloth. That is entirely up to your preference. This is just my workflow in particular. Don't try to blend red and green, kids. It doesn't always work out. Small details on their own, like this red and green part, should have its own shading as well, because remember that it is on top of a form, not necessarily just pasted on top. So keep that in mind when you're blending. For the sleeves, I'm attaching a scale pattern, not actually dithering, but it is very similar in technique. And this is, I guess it could be a small scale application of better blending techniques. I'm finishing up the flowers here. You'll see that I run into this issue where actually something could read as dithering when I meant for it to be a specific pattern, like the center of the flowers. And that's because at a small pixel scale, things like that just tend to get blurred. I am recoloring the lines because when you're making pixel art, you have to make use of what little space you have, and this will help it read clearer without having this solid black border around the entire piece. I'm adjusting based on what the lines are surrounding, and after that I am more or less done.